Is it's so good. It's worth being able to go home after, right, and say, there it is. It's one of those songs that keeps keeps being used at funerals. The whole idea that Jesus will be standing there with his arms wide open and greeting us and welcoming us. It's a beautiful image. Today, I don't think we can talk about the mountaintop experience for Jesus and the Transfiguration story without also considering Moses' mountaintop experience. And so, in addition to our scriptures from Luke, we're going to also go back to Exodus 34. So if you want to open your Bibles and join me, there are Bibles on the table if you didn't bring one. Exodus 34, 29 through 35. Moses came down from Mount Sinai, and as he came down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the covenant in his hand, Moses did not know the skin of his face shone because he had been talking with God. Now let me tell you, for those of you that don't know the story, that this is the second time that Moses went on the mountain. And this time he stayed for 40 days and 40 nights, okay? When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, the skin of his face was shining, and they were afraid to come near him. But Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the leaders of the congregation returned to him, and Moses spoke with them. Afterward, all the Israelites came near, and he gave them in commandment all that the Lord had spoken to him on Mount Sinai. When Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil on his face. But whenever Moses went in before the Lord to speak with him, he would take the veil off until he came out. And when he came out and told the Israelites what had been commanded, the Israelites would see the face of Moses, that the skin of his face was shining, and Moses would put the veil on his face again until he went in to speak with him. It's so interesting, this whole idea that this close encounter with God would physically change Moses, right? That often in movies, they not only have him with a glowing face, but they turn his hair white, right? This close encounter with God ages him in a way, but he glows so much that the people are afraid. Now, I went to a funeral yesterday for a man named Rev Heather, who has been a lifetime Christian and a faithful man who was very clear that he wanted his service to be about God and not about Dwayne. And it was interesting at the same time to hear people talk about him and the way he would fill a room with his presence. Now, he was, I would guess, 6'4", 6'5", so he did fill a room with his presence, but he also filled a room with his presence, right? I was watching the movie Valentine, and there's a line in there where Mr. Bouquet talks about his best friend, and he tries to describe her to a stranger, and he said, she is like sunshine. When she enters the room, everything is better, right? Wow. Wouldn't it be beautiful to have someone describe you in that way? That you are like sunshine, and when you enter a room, everything is better. So this story that we have of Moses is sort of the same thing, right? That he comes down from this close encounter with God, standing in the glory is the word that they use, the glory of God. What's so interesting about it is that Moses actually demands this encounter. He says to God, I want to see your glory. And up until this point, most people believed to face God would be death, right? That it would be so awesome and so amazing that if you faced God, that you would perish, right? And so Moses asked to see the glory of God. I don't know that he knew what he was asking, right? this beautiful story where he has this encounter. He comes down with the 10 Commandments. He comes down with the covenant between the people of God, and he is the mediator. Now he wears this veil, and it's really interesting because in the Greek translation, which is the one that is most often used by the New Revised Standard Version and the NIV, from the Greek translation, it translates veil, this covering for his face, right? But it's really interesting because in the Latin translation, they use a different Hebrew root word that is only used 3 times and only in this story, in the entire Hebrew Bible. And so the root word that they translate into other versions is horns, right? So it's really strange, this difference in this little bit of one word, that it can be translated veil or translated horns, right? Now, the horns don't make a lot of sense to me, because how would that keep you from seeing the glowing face of Moses, right? But there's a very famous statue that Michelangelo made based on the Latin translation, and I don't know if you've ever seen it, but in the statue of Moses, he has horns. And it's a result of this mountaintop experience, right? Now, there are those who believe that maybe Moses wore a mask that had horns on it, right? And that's where the translation. But the reality is, we don't know. There was nobody there to take pictures and load it onto Instagram and to tell us what Moses was wearing. But this whole idea that he glowed, that he shone so much that others were afraid, is an interesting thing, right? Because we think of light as a good thing. Now, I'm not the best gardener. I'm nowhere near. I don't even stand in the vicinity of the best gardener, but I do manage to keep houseplants alive, or every year I put out spring plants, and when it starts to get cold, I bring them to my sun porch, right? And in my sun porch, unless it gets super cold, they thrive. And it's so funny because Michelle and I were talking about how the seasonal plants, mine don't die, and how I must be tired of them by now, right? That my spring plants, I still have to care for them, and I still have to water them. But it's so fascinating because they literally grow towards the light. They change their entire shape, and you can see them leaning and reaching for the sunshine, right? And so I have to rotate them, or they literally go sideways, right? Which, when they're in the front yard and planted in your yard, you can't rotate them. So they all, and my house faces west, and so the plants all literally lay forward towards the sun, right? So this whole idea that light is nourishing and life-giving and good is a wonderful thing. And you can see why, in a world of so much darkness, that so often we use light as a way to talk about God or Jesus, that he brings the light into the darkness, right? So I want us to jump over to Luke now. And in Luke, we have this mountaintop experience of Jesus. And it's Luke chapter 9, verses 28 through 43. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James, and he went up on the mountain to pray. Now, if you weren't here a few weeks ago when I talked about the book of Luke, you need to know, when Jesus prays, big things happen. That it's almost always some kind of theological turning point or revealing, right? And so we get this moment. One, it's on a mountain. That's a big deal. Well, Hiroyuki just said, mountains are divine places, right? And I told him I was going to steal that from him because it's beautiful, right? Mountains are divine places. When we stand on mountains, we feel small, right? If we stand next to the ocean, we sort of get that experience as well, that we feel small. And we understand that creation is so much bigger than us. And for some reason, our problems seem so much smaller. when we have those mountaintop experiences. We start to realize that it isn't as big as we thought it was. And so Jesus is praying on this mountain. And because we understand Luke, we know something big is going to happen. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed and his clothes became dazzling white, right? So we hear this significant event that happens to Jesus very much like it happened to Moses. His face is changed and his clothes become white. And suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. And they appeared in glory. Do you hear that? Moses asked to see God in his glory. And then here we have the story where Jesus is in the glory of God. And in the glory, in the midst of this, you get Moses and Elijah, right? So we just heard the story of Moses, so we understand, right, that he represented the covenant between the people of God and God, that he brought us the covenant, right? And then Elijah has a mountaintop experience, which I actually preached on about 6 months ago, where he goes up on the mountain to pass down the mantle of the priesthood, where he is the mediator between God and his people. And he passes it, Elijah passes it to Elisha. Okay? And the difference is Elijah never leaves the mountain. He is taken up into the heavens, right? So the fact that we have these two supremely important prophets for the people of God who are standing on either side of Jesus is a big deal. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now, Luke is the only one that tells us about the conversation between Jesus and the other two. Luke is the only gospel that gives us this glimpse into what this conversation might be about. And he says about his departure. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving, Peter says to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings,